I am Charmaine, 35 years old, and somehow still recovering from the trauma inflicted by my family. As a successful software developer who quietly transitioned into running my own tech firm, I escaped their toxicity, but I still kept in touch occasionally. Last Sunday, they invited me to a lavish family anniversary dinner. Between champagne and caviar, my mother leaned forward smirking. Charmaine, you know you are so lucky we still invite you to these things. Pity works wonders. I just took a sip of my drink and smiled. What they did not know was that at my 20th birthday party, I quietly transferred my entire inheritance from my grandparents into a blind trust just as a precaution. That night at the dinner, my father proudly announced he had sold my inheritance behind my back to fund Jessica's husband's failing company. Before continuing this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Please like and subscribe if you have ever faced family members who underestimated your worth. Growing up in Fairfield, Connecticut, meant being privileged to outsiders. But inside our sprawling colonial home, emotional coldness permeated every corner. Our large house, with its neatly manicured lawn and heated pool, was a fortress of expectations I could never meet. My childhood bedroom, painted pale blue at my mother Elaine's request, despite my preference for green, became my prison. From elementary to high school, I maintained my upright character while participating in elite student councils and advanced classes. Yet nothing I did ever earned a nod of approval from my father, Richard. To him, my younger sister Jessica was the golden child. She was loud, demanding, and perfectly molded to their superficial standards. When she married Trevor, an arrogant white tech entrepreneur with a failing startup, my parents treated him like the son they wanted. I, on the other hand, was the family scapegoat, the quiet girl who preferred writing code over attending country club galas. They thought I was a nobody, a low-level programmer barely making ends meet. They had no idea I owned the very firm that held their debts. My grandparents, Arthur and Eleanor, were the only residents of our extended family who saw through the suffocating Fairfield facade. Arthur was a self-made real estate magnate who built his portfolio during the unforgiving economic downturns of the 70s. While my parents fawned over Jessica's loud, demanding tantrums, my grandfather would quietly pull me into his oak-paneled study. Instead of buying me designer clothes, he taught me how to read balance sheets, depreciation schedules, and commercial lease agreements by the time I was 12. He recognized my quiet, analytical nature not as a flaw, but as the exact temperament required to survive in the ruthless world of high finance. Money screams Charmaine, but wealth whispers. My grandfather told me one evening, watching my father obnoxiously pull up in a brand new sports car he could barely afford. Your father is a fool who buys liabilities to impress people he hates. You, my dear, have the mind to build empires. When they unexpectedly passed away during my freshman year of college, the reading of the will caused a seismic shockwave through the family. They left my parents a modest cash stipend, completely bypassing them to leave the crown jewel of their portfolio, the Sterling Plaza, directly to me. My parents were furious, masking their bitter jealousy with fake smiles while plotting exactly how they would pry that inheritance from my inexperienced hands. They underestimated just how well Arthur had trained me. The real nightmare began at their anniversary party. The event was held at our family estate, filled with catered food, live string music, and dozens of relatives who loved to judge me. I arrived wearing a simple black dress, wanting to avoid attention. I walked into the grand dining room and found my family gathered around the fireplace. Trevor was holding a glass of expensive scotch, laughing loudly at his own joke. Jessica hung on his arm, dripping in diamonds my parents had likely paid for. I stood near the edge of the room, hoping to just get through the evening. Then my father tapped his glass with a silver spoon to get everyone's attention. "Family and friends," my father announced, his voice booming across the room. "Tonight is not just about Elaine and me. It is about the future of our family legacy. As you all know, Trevor has been working tirelessly on his groundbreaking software company. And to ensure his massive success, I have made a vital executive decision." He turned to look directly at me, a cold, calculated smirk on his face. "I have officially signed the contract to sell the Sterling Plaza. The $45 million will clear on Monday morning and go directly into Trevor's corporate account. Oh, and Charmaine, you need to vacate your apartment by tomorrow. I used it as collateral for the bridge loan to finalize the paperwork. The room went completely silent. I stood there holding my glass, the familiar sting of their cruelty, quickly replaced by a profound icy calm. You sold the Sterling Plaza. Are you entirely sure you have the legal right to sell my grandparents' building? Dad? Trevor laughed loudly, stepping forward and invading my personal space. He reeked of expensive cologne and unearned arrogance. Do not be so petty, Charmaine. Let us be completely honest here. You write back-end code for some mid-level corporate database. You have absolutely no concept of capital allocation. My company is the true future of this family. Consider you're building a mandatory donation to my brilliance. Jessica chimed in, resting her head on his shoulder. Exactly. You should be thanking Dad for taking that burden off your hands. Besides, that dress you are wearing looks like it came from a discount rack. When Trevor takes his company public, we will be billionaires. Maybe if you behave, we will hire you to fetch coffee. My mother stepped up beside them, crossing her arms. Stop making a scene, Charmaine. You have always been so selfish. For once in your life, do something for your sister. To seal his perceived victory, my father pulled a folded piece of paper from his suit jacket. He held it up like a trophy. I have the power of attorney you signed 14 years ago. It gives me full executive control over your financial assets. I have already submitted it to the escrow agents. The deed is done. He shoved the paper back into his pocket, completely oblivious to the fact that the document had been legally nullified exactly 24 hours after I originally signed it. I just smiled, keeping my voice incredibly soft and steady. Trevor, I said, my tone shifting to something cold and sharp. Since you are such a brilliant visionary, I assume you had your legal team thoroughly review the buyer's purchase agreement, specifically the clauses regarding the fraudulent misrepresentation of asset ownership. You might want to review what happens to the guarantor's collateral when a seller attempts to transfer a property they do not legally own. Trevor frowned, a brief flash of confusion crossing his features before his arrogant mask slipped back into place. What are you talking about? Your dad owns it. Just read the fine print, Trevor, I said, grabbing my purse. I will see you all on Monday morning at 9. The sharp ding of the private elevator echoed through the penthouse suite of Apex Holdings promptly at 8 o'clock on Monday morning. The brushed steel doors slid open, and I stepped out onto the polished marble floor of my corporate sanctuary. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding panoramic view of the downtown financial district, bathing the sprawling reception area in crisp morning light. Good morning, boss. My executive assistant, Sarah, greeted me with a respectful nod as I walked past her pristine glass desk. I offered a polite smile in return, trading the modest black dress from my parents' suffocating anniversary party for a tailored charcoal gray designer suit that projected absolute authority. My heels clicked rhythmically against the stone tiles as I made my way down the expansive corridor. Passing through the open concept bullpen, several senior analysts and portfolio managers paused their morning briefings to offer deferential greetings. They knew me as the undisputed sole owner and chief executive officer of a multi-billion-dollar private equity empire, a self-made titan who ruthlessly navigated the most complex commercial acquisitions in the country. To them, I was a force of nature. To my family, I was merely the pathetic, underachieving spinster who supposedly wrote back-end code in a depressing basement. The sheer magnitude of their delusion was almost comical. I pushed open the heavy oak doors to my private office and walked over to my massive mahogany desk. The room was immaculately organized, featuring modern leather furniture, a fully stocked private bar, and multiple digital terminals displaying real-time global market fluctuations. But my attention was entirely focused on the thick cream-colored manila folder sitting dead center on my pristine blotter. The label on the tab read Sterling Plaza Acquisition. I sat down in my high-backed leather chair, took a sip of the black coffee Sarah had perfectly prepared, and opened the file. There it was. The legally binding commercial purchase agreement printed on crisp legal paper, outlining the $45 million transfer of my grandparents' commercial high-rise. I flipped straight to the signature page. My father Richard had signed his name with aggressive sweeping strokes, completely convinced he was executing a masterstroke of financial dominance. Right behind the primary contract was the supporting documentation his legal counsel had provided to my acquisition team to authorize the illicit sale. It was a scanned copy of a heavily creased power of attorney form. Staring at that specific piece of paper, my mind instantly pulled me back 14 years to the night of my 20th birthday. My parents had hosted a surprisingly lavish dinner for me, filling my glass with expensive champagne every time I took a single sip. They laughed, showered me with uncharacteristic affection, and made me feel for one fleeting evening like I actually belonged in their family. Then, when the room was spinning, and my judgment was thoroughly impaired by the alcohol, my father slid a stack of legal documents onto the dining table. "It is just standard administrative paperwork to help manage your college funds," he had promised, guiding my trembling hand to the signature line. "Trust us, Charmaine. We are looking out for your best interests." Desperate to maintain their sudden warmth, I blindly signed away the executive control over my entire life. But the illusion shattered the moment I woke up the next morning with a pounding headache. I overheard my mother on the phone in the hallway gleefully boasting to her friends that they finally had full legal access to the trust fund my grandparents had established for me. The sickening realization of their betrayal hit me like a physical blow to the chest. The physical hangover from the champagne was entirely eclipsed by the psychological nausea of their betrayal. I stood frozen in the hallway, leaning against the cold wallpaper, listening to my mother Elaine pace the kitchen floor with the phone pressed to her ear. Her voice was shrill with triumphant greed. "It was almost too easy, Susan," Elaine cackled into the receiver, speaking to my aunt. "We just poured her a few extra glasses of Moet, gave her a little bit of attention, and she signed the power of attorney without even reading the second page. Richard is heading to the bank on Monday to start transferring the liquid assets into our joint accounts. We can finally afford that summer house in the Hamptons. The boring daughter finally proved useful." I did not storm into the kitchen. I did not demand answers or throw a predictable emotional tantrum. In that precise, agonizing moment, the desperate, people-pleasing daughter they had abused for 2 decades died permanently. The woman who replaced her was cold, calculating, and driven by an absolute, unshakable need for self-preservation. I walked back to my pale blue bedroom, packed a single duffel bag, and slipped out the back door into the pouring rain. I hailed a cab and directed the driver straight to the offices of Sterling and Vance, the elite estate attorneys my grandfather had trusted with his life. Sitting in that mahogany boardroom, shivering in damp clothes, I looked the senior partner dead in the eye and initiated the absolute lockdown of my future. That morning, the Aegis Trust was not just formed as a financial vehicle, it was forged as a weapon. Within 3 hours of sitting in that mahogany boardroom, I drafted and filed the necessary paperwork to legally revoke that fraudulent power of attorney, neutralizing their control before they could drain a single cent. I did not stop there. Under the senior partner's strict guidance, I immediately transferred the deed to Sterling Plaza and all my remaining liquid inheritance into an ironclad, irrevocable blind trust named Aegis. I spent the next 14 years deliberately playing the role of the quiet, unremarkable daughter, letting them believe they held a loaded weapon while I built my massive corporate empire entirely in the shadows. They had been holding a legally dead document for over a decade, completely ignorant of the fact that it held absolutely zero judicial power. I traced my finger over my father's bold signature on the new purchase agreement. He had just committed textbook federal wire fraud by attempting to sell a multi-million-dollar asset that belonged exclusively to a blind trust he did not control. He signed a contract filled with severe, ruinous penalties. The sheer audacity of their greed was genuinely breathtaking. They had willingly offered up my current apartment as collateral to secure the bridge loan, fully intending to leave me homeless just to inflate Trevor's fragile ego and save his doomed startup. They felt absolutely no remorse about discarding me like trash. But business is business, and the corporate world operates on strict, unforgiving consequences. Apex Holdings was not just some faceless, generic buyer they could manipulate with their suburban arrogance. Apex Holdings was a highly sophisticated predatory financial vehicle designed to absorb assets from incompetent sellers who failed to verify their holdings. I smiled, closing the manila folder and resting my manicured hands smoothly on top of it. They wanted to play a high-stakes game of capital allocation, and they unknowingly invited the casino owner to the table. The trap was perfectly set, legally sound, and ready to snap shut. I pressed the silver intercom button on my desk to summon my legal team. The time for hiding was finally over, and the time for absolute destruction had officially arrived. I waited. My private office remained perfectly silent for exactly 3 seconds before the sharp trill of my secondary cellular phone shattered the stillness. It was a cheap prepaid device I kept exclusively for communicating with my family, a physical boundary separating my corporate empire from their suburban toxicity. The caller ID flashed my mother's name in stark white letters. Elaine was calling. I took a slow, deep breath to steady my heart rate and answered the call, pressing the phone to my ear while keeping my eyes fixed on the manila folder containing my father's fraudulent signature. "Where are you right now?" my mother demanded, bypassing any form of a standard greeting. Her voice was shrill, vibrating with the same manic energy she always carried when organizing one of her country club events. "You completely ruined the mood at the anniversary dinner last night, Charmaine. Your father was incredibly stressed after you left, muttering about breach of contract clauses. You always have to make everything about yourself, do you not?" "Good morning to you too, Mother," I replied, my voice smooth and devoid of any emotional reaction. "I am just at work. Is there a specific reason you are calling me during business hours?" "Your little data entry job can wait," Elaine scoffed, her disdain bleeding through the speaker. "I already called your building manager at that depressing apartment complex. You have until tomorrow to get your belongings out, but I need you at the family estate today. Trevor just ordered 2 custom sports cars to celebrate the capital injection his company is getting from the Sterling Plaza sale. They are being delivered this afternoon, and our main garage is filled with old holiday decorations and landscaping equipment." I leaned back in my leather chair, genuinely astounded by the sheer magnitude of her entitlement. "You want me to take time off from my job to come clean out your garage so your son-in-law can park the luxury cars he bought using my stolen inheritance?" "Do not use that tone with me, young lady," my mother snapped, her voice dropping into a harsh, authoritarian register. "You are being completely unreasonable and entirely selfish. We are saving that inheritance from your own financial incompetence. What were you going to do with a commercial high-rise? Let it sit empty. Trevor is an innovator. He needs that liquidity to scale his tech company. We are managing the family assets appropriately because you clearly lack the fundamental vision to do so yourself. Now get over here immediately and start packing those boxes. Consider it your apology for your embarrassing behavior last night." I looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse office, watching the city traffic flow far below. My family was so deeply entrenched in their own narcissism that they could not even fathom the reality of their situation. They genuinely believed I was their obedient, defeated scapegoat. They thought they had secured a $45 million windfall, and their biggest concern was clearing garage space for impulse purchases funded by phantom money. "I will be there in an hour, Mother," I said, my voice betraying absolutely none of the ruthless execution plan forming in my mind. "I will help you clear out the garage." "See that you do," Elaine huffed, "and wear something appropriate for manual labor this time." She terminated the call with a sharp click, leaving me listening to the dead air. I set the burner phone down on my desk, pushing it far away from the Sterling Plaza acquisition file. The time for playing the obedient victim had officially expired. The intercom on my desk buzzed, and Sarah's professional voice filled the room. "Boss, the chief legal officer is here. Are you ready for him?" "Send him in, Sarah," I commanded. The heavy oak doors swung open and Marcus stepped into my office. Marcus was a seasoned corporate litigator, a man who had orchestrated some of the most aggressive, hostile takeovers in the financial sector. He wore a tailored navy suit and carried a sleek digital tablet. He took a seat across from my desk, his expression entirely focused and strictly business. "Good morning, Charmaine," Marcus said, waking his tablet screen. "I reviewed the executed purchase agreement for Sterling Plaza." Richard Wilson signed the documents late last week, assuming the outdated power of attorney granted him full executive authority to liquidate the asset. The buyer, Apex Holdings, has technically accepted the terms pending final verification of escrow funds. He signed it, I confirmed, tapping the manila folder. My father officially committed federal wire fraud. He attempted to transfer a $45 million asset that has been securely held within the Aegis Blind Trust for 14 years. He used a legally dead document to authorize the sale, and he used my personal apartment as collateral to secure a short-term bridge loan for Trevor's failing software company. They are completely exposed. Marcus adjusted his glasses, a predatory gleam appearing in his sharp eyes. The purchase agreement is structured with zero tolerance for seller misrepresentation. By signing that contract, Richard triggered the automatic penalty clauses. If the seller fails to provide a clean, legally verifiable title upon the closing date, the buyer is entitled to seize the collateral immediately. "Execute the protocol," I ordered, my voice ringing with absolute certainty. "Contact the holding bank and freeze Richard's escrow accounts immediately. I want every single cent of that bridge loan locked down so Trevor cannot access a dime of it to pay his creditors. Once the accounts are frozen, I want you to prepare the federal fraud notifications. Draft the formal complaints for the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We are going to document every single fraudulent misrepresentation they made during this transaction." "Understood," Marcus replied, his fingers flying across the digital tablet to initiate the legal strikes. "Freezing the escrow accounts will instantly trigger a total default cascade for Trevor today." The trap was officially set. I left my corporate headquarters and took a car to the Fairfield estate, trading the silence of my penthouse for the loud reality of my family. The drive took an hour, giving Marcus enough time to execute the financial blockade. As my driver pulled up to the wrought iron gates, I instructed him to park down the street. I wanted to walk the rest of the way. I needed to step onto their territory, appearing small and defeated. The gravel crunched beneath my heels as I approached the circular driveway. Before reaching the front steps, I heard him. Trevor aggressively paced the driveway, shouting into his smartphone. He wore a stereotypical tech founder uniform consisting of a dark shirt, overpriced sneakers, and a tailored blazer. His voice carried across the lawn, dripping with that specific brand of arrogant desperation I had personally seen in countless failing entrepreneurs. "Listen to me, David. I am telling you the liquidity issue is resolved," Trevor barked into the phone, waving his free hand. "The bridge loan is secured and the $45 million real estate transfer clears Monday morning. Yes, $45 million. I am fully capitalized. We are scaling the operation next week. Just hold the creditors off for 48 hours. Tell them the capital injection is guaranteed by a hard asset. I am going to make us all billionaires." He laughed loudly, a hollow sound that echoed against the brick facade. He ended the call without waiting for a response and let out a triumphant whoop, punching the air like a victorious athlete. He spun around and finally noticed me standing quietly at the edge of the driveway. His momentary surprise vanished instantly, replaced by a predatory, mocking grin. "Well, look who showed up," Trevor sneered, strutting toward me with an exaggerated swagger. "I was placing bets with Jessica on whether you would actually come or if you would just sit in your sad little apartment and cry about getting evicted. It is good to see you are finally learning how to follow instructions, Charmaine." He stopped a few feet away, crossing his arms to deliberately expose his left wrist. Gleaming in the afternoon sun was a new solid gold Rolex. It was a massive, ostentatious timepiece that screamed new money and poor financial planning. "Do you like it?" he asked, catching my gaze and shaking his wrist so the heavy gold links clinked together. "I just picked it up this morning, custom ordered. When you are operating at my level, you have to project success to attract success. The dealer let me take it on credit the second I showed him the escrow documentation for Sterling Plaza. That is the beauty of being a high-net-worth individual, Charmaine. The world opens its doors for you. I looked at the watch, calculating its exact retail value and comparing it to the massive debt he was currently drowning in. He was buying luxury goods on credit backed by a bridge loan secured by a fraudulent contract. It was a spectacular display of financial suicide. "It is certainly a bold purchase, Trevor," I said, keeping my voice perfectly neutral, "especially considering the funds have not officially cleared the banking protocols yet." Trevor rolled his eyes, letting out a heavy, exasperated sigh. He looked at me as if I were a particularly slow child who was failing to grasp basic arithmetic. He took a step closer, towering over me to assert his physical dominance. "This is exactly why you have been stuck in the same miserable tax bracket your entire life." Trevor explained, his voice thick with condescension. "You have no concept of leverage. You think like a poor person. You wait for the money to be in your hand before you act. That is why you will never build anything meaningful. White men in tech understand that capital is just a tool to manipulate reality. We do not wait for permission. We create momentum. We leverage assets to force the market to bend to our will." He pointed a finger directly at my chest, tapping the air to emphasize his words. "You see a building and you think about collecting rent. I see a financial vehicle to disrupt an entire global industry. It takes a specific type of aggressive intellect to maneuver large-scale capital, Charmaine. It is not something you could ever understand. You should honestly be taking notes right now. You might actually learn how the real world operates." I stood perfectly still, absorbing every word of his sexist, arrogant lecture. He was a man who had never generated a single dollar of actual profit, lecturing a self-made female billionaire on the mechanics of capital manipulation. The irony was so dense it was almost suffocating. He was actively mocking me while standing on the gallows I had just built for him. "You have a very unique perspective on financial leverage, Trevor," I replied calmly, locking my eyes with his. "I am sure your aggressive intellect will serve you incredibly well when the final audits are conducted." "It already has," he boasted, adjusting his jacket and flashing the Rolex one more time. "Now hurry up and get inside. Elaine wants the garage completely cleared out by 3 o'clock. I have 2 Porsche cars being delivered, and I am not leaving them parked in the driveway just because you are moving slowly. Be useful for once." He turned his back on me and marched up the front steps of the mansion, pulling out his phone to make another boastful call to another anxious creditor. I watched him disappear through the heavy oak doors, marveling at his sheer blindness. He felt incredibly untouchable. He was completely oblivious to the fact his bank accounts were being frozen by my legal team. His creditors were receiving federal fraud alerts, and the $45 million he was bragging about was a ghost. I smoothed my suit and followed him. Stepping through the heavy oak doors of the Fairfield mansion transported me back to a childhood I had spent years trying to actively forget. The grand foyer was an exercise in excessive wealth, dominated by a sweeping mahogany staircase and a massive crystal chandelier that cast fractured, glittering light across the imported marble floor. The air smelled of expensive floral arrangements and the faint, lingering scent of my mother's signature lavender perfume. Voices echoed from the formal living room to my right. I walked slowly down the hallway, my heels clicking softly against the stone, projecting a quiet confidence that completely contradicted the submissive role they expected me to play. I found my parents sitting on custom-upholstered sofas, sipping espresso, as if they had not just attempted to completely ruin my life. My father Richard looked up from a thick stack of legal documents spread across the glass coffee table. His expression immediately hardened into a mask of pure, unfiltered irritation. "You certainly took your time getting here," my father snapped, not bothering to offer any form of a standard greeting. He stood up abruptly, adjusting his expensive silk tie, and gestured sharply toward the chaotic pile of paperwork. "Do not just stand there hovering in the doorway like a lost child, Charmaine. Come over here and make yourself useful for a change. We have a minor administrative hurdle to clear before the bank officially releases Trevor's funds on Monday morning." Trevor followed me into the room, his loud footsteps announcing his presence before he even spoke. He threw himself into a leather armchair, kicking his feet up onto a matching ottoman. Jessica was lounging in a wingback chair nearby, scrolling mindlessly through her smartphone. She did not even bother to look up as I approached the center of the room. I stopped at the edge of the coffee table, keeping my posture perfectly straight and my expression carefully blank. "What exactly is the hurdle, Dad?" I asked, looking down at the pristine stacks of paper that documented his impending financial doom. My father picked up a single sheet printed on thick premium cardstock. The corporate buyer handling the acquisition, a major investment firm called Apex Holdings, has a notoriously aggressive legal department. He explained, his tone dripping with extreme impatience and unearned authority. Their compliance officers noticed a minor historical discrepancy regarding the original deed of the Sterling Plaza. "Because your grandparents originally listed you as the primary beneficiary before I rightfully took over via the power of attorney, Apex Holdings is demanding a standard waiver of claims from you. It is just a routine legal formality to ensure you cannot contest the sale, delay the transfer of funds, or claim any future rights to the property." He shoved the document and a heavy gold pen across the polished glass table toward me. "Sign your name at the bottom so we can finish this." I looked down at the waiver resting near my fingertips. The document was an ironclad release of liability, meticulously drafted by my own chief legal officer, Marcus, just 3 hours ago. It was explicitly designed to finalize the legal trap we had set. By demanding this specific signature, my legal team was ensuring that when the hammer finally fell, my father could never claim ignorance or point to an administrative error in court. He was willingly pushing the final nail into his own coffin, completely blind to the reality of his actions. "And what exactly happens if I decide not to sign this waiver?" I asked, quietly testing the absolute limits of his desperation. My father's face flushed a deep, angry red. The veins in his neck pulsed visibly against his starched white collar. "If you do not sign that piece of paper right now, I will permanently disown you." He threatened, his voice dropping into a vicious, menacing growl that echoed through the large room. "I will completely erase you from this family. You will be cut out of every will, every trust, and every family event for the rest of your miserable life. You will be dead to me, Charmaine. You are already a profound disappointment. But if you ruin this monumental opportunity for Trevor, I will ensure you die absolutely alone with nothing to your name. I will make sure you are left with absolutely zero resources. Just sign the stupid paper, Charmaine." Jessica sighed heavily, finally looking up from her glowing screen with an expression of intense boredom. "Stop trying to make yourself feel important. You are literally holding up a $45 million transaction because you want 5 minutes of pathetic attention. It is embarrassing to watch you beg for relevance." Trevor laughed from his armchair, flashing his ridiculous new watch. "She just wants to feel like a big corporate player for 30 seconds. Let her have her little moment of rebellion before she goes back to her cubicle." I picked up the heavy gold pen. I did not argue with them. I did not shed a single tear. I simply leaned over the glass coffee table and pressed the tip of the pen to the designated signature line. I deliberately scribbled a completely illegible looping signature that looked absolutely nothing like my actual name. However, directly beneath that messy scrawl on the blank line, explicitly designated for the signatory's official legal title, I wrote with pristine, unmistakable clarity, "Chief Executive Officer, Apex Holdings." I placed the gold pen down on the glass surface and pushed the document back across the table. My father snatched it up immediately, completely ignoring the fine print beneath my hand. He barely glanced at the ink before shoving the waiver triumphantly into his leather briefcase. He possessed absolutely zero attention to detail, a fatal and pathetic flaw in the ruthless corporate world. "Finally," my father grunted, dismissing my presence completely. "Now go out and start packing those boxes." I smiled brightly, knowing their absolute destruction was now legally guaranteed and entirely inescapable. Leaving the suffocating atmosphere of the Fairfield mansion behind, I stepped into the waiting town car and directed my driver to head straight back to the Apex Holdings headquarters. I watched the skyline approach, my mind shifting from family politics back to ruthless corporate strategy. I needed to understand the exact mechanics of Trevor's desperation, as this was now a critical mission for my company. Upon arriving at the penthouse suite, I walked directly into the primary glass-walled conference room. Marcus was already waiting at the head of the polished obsidian table. Joining him was my chief financial officer, Elena. Spread across the table were dozens of illuminated digital tablets, all displaying detailed forensic accounting reports. I looked at Elena. "Tell me everything we know about Trevor's software company." I commanded, ready to hear the exact details of his supposed tech empire. Elena tapped her tablet, projecting a complex web of financial transactions onto the large monitor mounted on the wall. Trevor is the founder and chief executive officer of Novacore Solutions. Elena began, her voice perfectly clinical. Publicly, he projects the image of a rapidly scaling financial technology startup. However, my forensic team spent the last 3 hours tearing apart their public filings and shadow ledgers. The entire operation is a complete house of cards. Novacore is not a functioning software company. It is a highly sophisticated Ponzi scheme. I raised an eyebrow, genuinely intrigued. I knew Trevor was incompetent, but I had not fully anticipated outright criminality. Explain the cash burn rate. Where exactly is the investor capital going if not into software development? Elena swiped her finger across her tablet, sending a cascade of damning banking records to the main display. Look at the offshore routing numbers, she instructed, highlighting a series of massive wire transfers in bright red. Trevor realized 6 months ago that his predictive algorithm software was a complete failure. To keep his initial venture capitalists from demanding their money back, he hired a cheap click farm in Eastern Europe to generate tens of thousands of fake user profiles. He is using new investor capital to pay off the early investors through shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands. He has been committing corporate wire fraud on a massive scale, Marcus chimed in, pulling up a secondary document. But his fatal flaw is his vanity. We tracked over $2.5 million of restricted corporate funds directly into their joint personal checking accounts. He classified Jessica's diamond tennis bracelets as marketing expenses. He even used the company's payroll accounts to secure the financing for that solid gold Rolex. How has he managed to avoid triggering an internal investigation from his own board of directors? I asked, analyzing the data on the screen. He falsified the user acquisition metrics to create the illusion of exponential revenue growth, Elena explained. But time is up. We discovered a highly confidential legal notice buried in their corporate filings. Novacore Solutions is scheduled for a comprehensive federal audit by the Securities and Exchange Commission this coming Wednesday. When the SEC auditors open these books, they will not just find administrative errors. They are going to demand hard proof of his liquidity, and they will find a multi-million-dollar federal embezzlement operation hiding in plain sight. The missing piece of the puzzle finally clicked into place. The overwhelming sense of urgency, the frantic phone calls in the driveway, and his desperate need to close the Sterling Plaza deal immediately. He needs the $45 million from my inheritance to cover his tracks. I said, a cold realization washing over me. He is planning to dump the stolen money back into the corporate accounts on Monday morning, right before the federal auditors arrive. He thinks the cash injection from the real estate sale will balance the ledgers and save him from federal prison. Exactly, Marcus confirmed, a predatory smile crossing his face. Trevor desperately needed a massive untraceable cash infusion to cover up his embezzlement. Your father offered up Sterling Plaza completely blind to the fact that he was financing a criminal enterprise. Richard thinks he is funding the next great technology boom. In reality, he is acting as an accessory to corporate wire fraud. The stakes had just been raised to an entirely new level. This was no longer just about protecting my inheritance from a greedy family. I was now holding the detonation switch to a massive federal crime. By freezing the escrow accounts and blocking the sale, I was not just stopping a theft. I was forcing Trevor to face the federal authorities empty-handed. Trevor is going to be indicted the moment the auditors open those books on Wednesday, Elena stated, closing her tablet with a definitive click. Without the Sterling Plaza funds to cover his embezzlement, his entire narrative collapses. The Securities and Exchange Commission will seize his remaining assets, and he will face a very lengthy prison sentence. I stood up and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the sprawling city skyline. My family had treated me like a useless burden for my entire life. Now they were preparing to host a massive celebration dinner to brag about their incredible financial success. They wanted to humiliate me one last time before Trevor took his stolen crown. I turned back to face my executive team, my mind fully resolved. Draft the final default notices. I ordered, my voice ringing with absolute unshakable authority. Prepare the breach of contract penalties and print the eviction mandates for the Fairfield estate. I want every single document bound in a physical portfolio. We are going to serve them the destruction of their empire in person. Let them enjoy their fake victory for a few more days. I want them to reach the absolute peak of their arrogance before we tear it all down completely. Marcus and Elena nodded in perfect unison, immediately setting to work on the legal documentation. The countdown to the celebration dinner had officially begun. I walked out of the conference room feeling an immense, powerful sense of anticipation. I was going to dismantle their entire reality brick by stolen brick. The arrogant expressions they wore at the anniversary party would soon transform into utter despair. I would finally watch them all lose absolutely everything they ever valued, proving my ultimate corporate superiority forever. Friday evening arrived with a chilling, crisp breeze sweeping through the city, setting the perfect stage for my family's grand delusion. My parents had spared absolutely no expense for what they proudly dubbed their official closing dinner. The venue was an exclusive five-star French restaurant downtown that required reservations months in advance, or in my father's case, a massive bribe to the general manager. They had rented the private dining room, a lavish space featuring vaulted ceilings, crystal chandeliers, and walls lined with vintage wine cellars. It was a spectacular display of premature celebration, funded entirely by a phantom financial windfall. I arrived exactly 20 minutes late, wearing a sharp, tailored navy suit that blended seamlessly into the elegant shadows of the room. The heavy mahogany doors were already closed when I approached, muffling the raucous laughter. I pushed them open quietly and slipped inside without making a single sound. The long banquet table was packed with the entire extended family. Aunts, uncles, and cousins I had not seen in years were seated around the pristine white tablecloth, gorging themselves on imported caviar and Wagyu beef. At the head of the table sat my father, Richard, radiating an unbearable level of smug satisfaction. To his right was Trevor, holding court like a conquering king returning from a victorious battle. Jessica was draped over him, showing off a new diamond tennis bracelet that she had undoubtedly charged to one of their maxed-out credit cards. I walked silently toward the far end of the room and took the only empty seat available, situated right next to the kitchen doors. Nobody bothered to greet me. My Aunt Susan, a notoriously judgmental woman who thrived on gossip, glanced in my direction and offered a tight, patronizing smile. "Charmaine, you made it," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy. "Elaine told us you were having a difficult week with your housing situation. You really should try to be more supportive of your brother-in-law today. It is unseemly to hold on to jealousy when the family is achieving such massive success." I offered a polite, closed-mouth smile and unfolded my linen napkin. "I am not jealous at all, Aunt Susan. I am simply here to witness the final outcome of this extraordinary transaction." My mother Elaine overheard the exchange from her seat across the table. She adjusted her posture and projected her voice so the entire room could hear. "We are all trying to be very patient with Charmaine," my mother announced dramatically. "It is incredibly hard for her to accept that Trevor was able to optimize an asset she was just letting rot. But tonight is about celebrating vision and bold execution. We are not going to let negative energy drag down this beautiful evening." A chorus of agreeable murmurs swept through the room. My Uncle David raised his glass of vintage Bordeaux, tapping it lightly with a silver fork. "To Trevor," David cheered loudly. "It takes a brilliant, aggressive mind to navigate the technology sector and secure a $45 million valuation out of thin air. You are the absolute genius of this family's son. You prove that white men in tech still know how to drive the global economy." "Hear, hear," Trevor shouted, raising his own glass and basking in the unearned adoration. "I appreciate that, David. It really just comes down to knowing how to leverage capital and force the market to respect your presence. My startup is going to revolutionize the financial sector, and I am incredibly grateful that Richard had the foresight to back a winner instead of letting that real estate sit uselessly in the hands of someone who lacks basic business acumen. He cast a pointed, mocking glare down the length of the table directly at me. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water, maintaining perfect, unwavering eye contact with him. The sheer concentrated arrogance in the room was palpable. They were throwing a lavish victory parade on the deck of a sinking ship. My father clapped Trevor firmly on the shoulder, his chest puffed out with toxic pride. "We knew you were the right horse to back from the moment Jessica brought you home. You are building a legacy, Trevor. A real tangible legacy that this family will ride for generations." The conversation quickly shifted to their extravagant plans for the future. Elaine leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with absolute greed. "Actually, everyone, Richard and I have our own special announcement to make tonight," she declared, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "Now that Trevor's company is fully funded, the bridge loan Richard facilitated leaves us with a substantial amount of surplus liquidity from our other investments. We have officially placed a deposit on a 60-foot luxury yacht. We will be spending the winter cruising the Mediterranean." The extended family gasped in performative awe, showering my parents with eager compliments and desperate attempts to secure an invitation aboard the Phantom vessel. Jessica squealed with delight, clapping her hands together. "Oh my God, Mom, that is so amazing. Trevor and I will definitely fly out to join you guys in Monaco once the software launch is complete." They were literally dividing up a non-existent fortune, completely detached from reality. The unbearable smugness of the villains reached its absolute peak, suffocating the entire dining room in a thick fog of delusion. I watched them gorge on expensive food, completely oblivious to the legal firing squad surrounding them. I checked the slim silver watch on my wrist. The timing was aligning perfectly. Soon the illusion they constructed over the past week would violently shatter. They had spent the entire evening insulting my intelligence, mocking my career, and celebrating a corporate crime they were too stupid to understand. They laughed and drank to their financial supremacy. I sat silently at the end of the long table, the invisible architect of their impending destruction, patiently waiting for the doors to open. The heavy mahogany doors to the private dining room swung open with a slow, dramatic creak that instantly silenced the surrounding chatter. Standing in the threshold was Marcus, my chief legal officer, flanked by two corporate associates who looked like federal agents. They wore immaculate tailored charcoal suits and carried thick leather briefcases. The sheer gravity of their presence immediately sucked the celebratory air right out of the room. I remained perfectly still at the far end of the banquet table, sipping my sparkling water as the final act of this tragedy commenced. My father Richard, completely oblivious to the impending danger, pushed his chair back and stood up with a massive greedy grin plastered across his face. He quickly wiped his mouth with a linen napkin, clearly assuming these severe-looking men were high-level couriers sent to deliver the confirmation of his $45 million payday. "Ah, wonderful," my father boomed loudly, his voice echoing off the vintage wine cellars lining the walls. "Right on time. Welcome, gentlemen. Please join the celebration. I assume you are the executive representatives from Apex Holdings, sent to finalize the escrow clearance for Sterling Plaza." Marcus did not smile. He stepped fully into the dining room, his polished shoes clicking against the hardwood floor with a slow, deliberate rhythm. His two associates followed closely behind, their faces carved from stone. They did not look at the extravagant spread of Wagyu beef and imported caviar. They looked directly at my father with the cold gaze of predators who had cornered their prey. "We are indeed the executive representatives from Apex Holdings," Marcus stated calmly, his voice a low, resonant baritone commanding absolute authority. My father practically vibrated with excitement. He puffed out his chest and gestured toward the center of the table. "Excellent. I am Richard, the primary seller and executor of the estate, and this remarkable young man right here is my son-in-law, Trevor. He is the visionary founder and chief executive officer of Novacore Solutions. He is the brilliant mind who will receive the capital injection. Trevor stood up, buttoning his blazer with an arrogant flick of his wrist. He flashed his unpaid Rolex toward the corporate attorneys, adopting the posture of a seasoned Silicon Valley titan. "Gentlemen," Trevor drawled, offering a condescending nod. "It is a pleasure to conclude this transaction. I know institutional buyers get bogged down in red tape, but I am glad your compliance team pushed the paperwork through. I need that liquidity flowing into my corporate accounts by Monday morning at the latest." Richard stepped forward, extending his hand toward Marcus to seal the victory. "Let us skip formalities and get to the bottom line. You hand over the final confirmation documents, and I will buy you all a round of the most expensive scotch this restaurant offers." Marcus stopped walking. He looked down at my father's outstretched hand, then slowly raised his gaze to meet Richard's eyes. Marcus did not reach out. He simply let my father's hand hang suspended in the empty air. The silence that followed was agonizingly loud. It stretched on for 5 brutal seconds. The celebratory energy in the room evaporated instantly, replaced by a thick, suffocating wave of sudden discomfort. My father's smile faltered. His hand twitched before he awkwardly lowered it, clearing his throat to mask his embarrassment. My mother Elaine shifted uneasily in her seat, her eyes darting between Marcus and Richard. Jessica stopped playing with her diamond tennis bracelet, a look of confusion crossing her face. The extended family members, previously cheering and toasting to their phantom yacht, suddenly found the patterns on the tablecloth fascinating. "Is there a problem?" Trevor demanded, his voice losing its swagger. He stepped out from behind the table. "We provided the signed purchase agreement and the historical deed. We even had my sister-in-law sign your ridiculous waiver of claims this afternoon. The property title is clean and the bridge loan is secured. You have zero legal standing to delay the release of my funds." Marcus turned his attention to Trevor. He looked at the failing tech bro the way a scientist examines a repulsive insect under a microscope. "Your funds," Marcus repeated the words, sounding metallic in the quiet dining room. "Yes, my funds." Trevor snapped, his face flushing with anger. "I am the primary beneficiary of the capital transfer. Are you handing over the escrow clearance, or do I need my legal team to threaten your firm with a breach of contract lawsuit?" At the far end of this table, I carefully placed my glass down on the crisp white linen. The sheer audacity of Trevor threatening to sue my own company for a breach of contract was a beautiful symphony of poetic justice. Marcus did not react to the threat. Instead, he gave a nearly imperceptible nod to his left. One corporate associate turned around, grasped the heavy brass handles of the dining room doors, and pulled them firmly shut. The click of the latch locking into place sounded like a prison cell slamming closed. The private dining room was now completely sealed off from the rest of the restaurant. There would be no interruptions, and more importantly, there would be no easy escape. My father took a nervous step backward, his eyes widening as the harsh reality of the locked doors registered. "What is the meaning of this?" Richard asked, his voice trembling slightly. "If you are not here to deliver the final check, why did you come to my private dinner?" Marcus unbuttoned his suit jacket and reached for the thick leather briefcase held by his second associate. He placed the heavy briefcase directly onto the dining table right next to my father's half-eaten plate of Wagyu beef. "We are not here to deliver a check, Richard," Marcus stated, his voice completely devoid of any human warmth or professional courtesy. "We are here to serve you." The heavy leather briefcase hit the pristine white tablecloth with a dull thud that made the crystal wine glasses rattle. Marcus maintained strict eye contact with my father while unclasping the brass locks. He extracted a massive stack of legal documents bound by a thick red band, dropping them directly next to my father's plate of imported Wagyu beef. The volume of paperwork sucked the remaining oxygen out of the private dining room. "Serve me," my father echoed, his voice pitching upward as reality struggled to penetrate his thick layer of suburban arrogance. He looked down at the documents, a nervous, involuntary laugh escaping his lips. "What kind of ridiculous joke is this? We have a signed purchase agreement. The escrow period is over. You are supposed to be transferring $45 million to my son-in-law tonight. If this is a last-minute negotiation tactic from Apex Holdings to lower the acquisition price, you have severely miscalculated. Trevor pushed his chair back, his face flushing with anger. You cannot renegotiate a finalized contract. We locked the terms. I have investors waiting for that capital injection on Monday morning. If you are trying to squeeze us, I will have my legal team tear your firm apart. Marcus slowly turned his head to look at Trevor. Your legal team will be entirely occupied with federal defense attorneys by Wednesday, Trevor. I suggest you remain silent and listen very carefully to what is about to happen to your father-in-law. Marcus turned his attention back to Richard, tapping a manicured finger against the top of the towering stack of documents. Richard, you executed a commercial real estate purchase agreement on behalf of a property known as Sterling Plaza. You signed official closing documents, initiated a transfer of title, and secured a short-term bridge loan using an affiliated residential property as collateral. You represented yourself to Apex Holdings as the sole legal executor of those assets. Because I am the executor, my father barked, his face turning a dangerous shade of red. He reached into his suit pocket and yanked out the folded, yellowed piece of paper he had been waving in my face earlier that afternoon. He slammed it down onto a nearby glass serving tray. I hold the official power of attorney. My daughter signed it 14 years ago. It gives me absolute unmitigated executive control over her entire financial portfolio. I have the legal right to liquidate any asset bearing her name. Your compliance department already reviewed this document. They cleared the transaction. Our compliance department reviewed the document you submitted, Marcus corrected smoothly, his voice slicing through my father's bluster like a surgical scalpel. And they immediately flagged it as a fraudulent instrument. That piece of paper you are waving around is legally dead, Richard. It has absolutely zero judicial authority. The entire table seemed to stop breathing. My mother Elaine gripped the edge of her seat, her knuckles turning stark white. Jessica leaned forward, her mouth slightly open in profound confusion. What are you talking about? My father demanded, his voice cracking. It is a notarized legal document. It bears her authentic signature. It is completely binding. It was binding for exactly 14 hours, Marcus stated, crossing his arms over his tailored chest. On the morning after your daughter's 20th birthday, she walked into a certified estate attorney's office and filed a formal, irrevocable revocation of that specific power of attorney. She legally nullified your access to her accounts before the ink on your copy was even fully dry. For the last 14 years, you have been holding a meaningless, invalidated piece of paper. My father stared at Marcus, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. The blood rapidly drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. He looked down at the yellowed document in his hand as if it had suddenly caught fire. That is impossible, my father whispered, the arrogant bluster entirely stripped from his voice. The building is in her name. The deed is registered to Charmaine. The building was in her name 14 years ago, Marcus corrected, pulling the top document from the stack and sliding it across the tablecloth. Immediately after revoking your unauthorized access, your daughter transferred the deed for Sterling Plaza, along with all of her liquid financial inheritance, into a highly secure, irrevocable blind trust known as Aegis. She does not own the building as an individual citizen. A protected corporate entity owns the building. Therefore, you cannot sell it. Trevor jumped up from his chair, his hands gripping his hair in absolute panic. Wait, what does that mean? What is he saying, Richard? Does he mean we are not getting the $45 million? Marcus did not give my father a chance to answer. He delivered the final, devastating legal blow with ruthless precision. It means, Richard, that you just attempted to sell a multi-million-dollar commercial high-rise that you do not own on behalf of a corporate entity you do not represent to an institutional buyer who has thoroughly documented your every move. You transmitted fraudulent financial documents across state lines to secure a bridge loan. You did not just fail to close a real estate deal today. You committed textbook, undeniable federal wire fraud. The silence in the private dining room became absolute heavy and terrifying. The reality of the situation crashed down upon the family like a collapsing concrete ceiling. My father sank slowly back into his chair, his eyes wide and unblinking, staring vacantly at the stack of legal documents that had just ended his life. He was no longer a wealthy suburban patriarch orchestrating a massive corporate deal. He was a desperate criminal who had just handed his own head to the executioner. All the aunts and uncles watched in horrified realization as the perfect family facade violently crumbled into dust. The merciless execution of their greed had only just begun. The heavy silence in the private dining room was suddenly shattered by the sharp sound of Marcus flipping to a specific page within the massive stack of legal documents. He slid a single highlighted sheet of paper across the pristine white tablecloth, pushing it until it rested directly under my father's trembling hands. It was the master purchase agreement for Sterling Plaza, the very contract Richard and Trevor had spent the entire week bragging about to anyone who would listen. Marcus tapped his silver pen against a densely worded paragraph near the bottom of the page. I direct your attention to Section 8.4 of the Apex Holdings Commercial Acquisition Agreement. Marcus instructed, his voice projecting absolute terrifying authority over the room. This specific clause outlines the punitive measures for seller misrepresentation and title fraud. By signing this binding contract, you legally guaranteed that you held a clean, undisputed title to the asset in question. Because you attempted to sell unverified assets that belong exclusively to the Aegis Blind Trust, you have triggered an immediate, non-negotiable breach of contract penalty. My father swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically across the complex legal jargon. A penalty. Richard croaked, a bead of cold sweat rolling down his temple. What kind of penalty? We can just cancel the transaction. We can tear up the contract right now and walk away. No harm done. Apex Holdings gets their bridge loan money back and we all just move on. Marcus let out a short, humorless laugh that chilled the room. You do not get to commit federal wire fraud and simply walk away when you get caught, Richard. Apex Holdings is not a charity. It is a highly aggressive private equity firm. As per the stipulations you willingly signed and executed, triggering Section 8.4, incurs an immediate liquid penalty of $20 million. That fine is due the moment the title verification fails. $20 million! My mother Elaine shrieked, jumping up from her chair. The expensive wine in her glass sloshed over the rim, staining the white tablecloth blood red. That is absolute extortion. We do not have $20 million in liquid cash. You cannot possibly enforce a ridiculous penalty like that over a simple administrative error. It is not an administrative error, Elaine, and we do not need you to write us a check. Marcus countered, his gaze shifting to my mother with lethal precision. Apex Holdings never relies on the goodwill of fraudulent sellers. They rely on the hard assets you pledged as collateral to secure the initial bridge loan and guarantee the escrow process. Marcus pulled a secondary document from his leather briefcase. It was the collateral schedule, signed and notarized. He began reading the itemized list aloud, letting the devastating reality of their greed wash over the dining room. To guarantee this transaction and facilitate Trevor's immediate access to the bridge loan, you pledged several major personal assets, Richard, Marcus stated calmly, listing them off. First, you pledged your primary residential estate in Fairfield, Connecticut. Second, you pledged your entire portfolio of private retirement accounts. And finally, Trevor pledged a controlling 80% equity stake in his software company, Novacore Solutions. Trevor stopped breathing. His arrogant, self-satisfied posture completely collapsed. He stared at Marcus as if the lawyer had just pulled the pin on a live grenade and dropped it onto his dinner plate. Because you cannot pay the $20 million breach of contract penalty in cash, Marcus explained, leaning forward to deliver the killing blow. Apex Holdings is legally exercising its right to seize all pledged collateral immediately. The Fairfield mansion, your retirement funds, and Trevor's entire company are now officially forfeited to the buyer. You have absolutely nothing left. The room erupted into absolute chaos. My Aunt Susan gasped loudly, covering her mouth with her hands as she looked at my parents with sudden, unfiltered disgust. The relatives who had just been begging for yacht invitations were now physically scooting their chairs away from my father, treating him like he carried a highly contagious disease. They realized instantly that Richard was no longer a wealthy patriarch to be admired. He was a radioactive liability who was about to be federally indicted and entirely bankrupted. My father frantically grabbed the contract, his hands shaking so violently he nearly tore the thick paper. He read the penalty clauses over and over again, his lips moving silently, as his brain desperately tried to find a loophole that did not exist. The legal language was ironclad, drafted by the sharpest corporate litigators in the country. He had blindly signed away his entire life just to prove a point, completely blinded by his insatiable need to appear superior. "This cannot be happening," Richard mumbled, dropping the contract onto the table. I read the agreement. My lawyers looked at it. They said the collateral was just a standard placeholder. They said Apex Holdings would never actually seize the assets unless we intentionally defaulted. "You did intentionally default the second you submitted a dead power of attorney to a federal bank." Marcus shot back, snapping his briefcase shut. "Your legal counsel was either wildly incompetent or deliberately misled by your own arrogant assertions that you controlled your daughter's trust. The moment your signature hit that line, you signed away your home, your savings, and your son-in-law's future." I remained seated at the end of the table, watching the sheer devastation unfold with profound satisfaction. I did not say a word. I simply observed the exact moment my family realized their staggering privilege had been completely dismantled. The magnitude of the financial annihilation hung heavy in the stifling air. Trevor remained frozen in his chair, his eyes darting frantically between my father and the terrifying corporate lawyer. The arrogant tech entrepreneur suddenly understood the catastrophic error he had made by tying his volatile startup to my father's fraudulent real estate maneuver. By using his company as a secondary guarantee for the bridge loan, he had handed the keys to his entire business over to a ruthless corporate entity. His brand new solid gold Rolex felt like a pair of heavy handcuffs wrapping tightly around his wrist. He knew he could never escape this nightmare. The terrifying reality of absolute ruin was finally setting in deeply. The glorious celebration they had maliciously planned to rub in my face was permanently destroyed. They had danced blindly on the precipice of poverty, entirely unaware that their own staggering greed was the very weapon actively pushing them over the dark edge. Trevor broke the heavy silence with a sound that resembled a cornered animal gasping for air. He gripped the edge of the dining table, his knuckles turning stark white as he pushed himself up from his chair. The tailored blazer that had looked so effortlessly stylish just 20 minutes ago now hung on his trembling frame like a poorly fitted costume. He glared at my father, his chest heaving as the catastrophic reality of the situation finally breached his thick skull. The arrogant tech entrepreneur persona he had so carefully crafted over the years evaporated in a single instant. He was no longer the visionary genius, bringing a $45 million capital injection into the family. He was a desperate, terrified man, watching his entire life disintegrate before his very eyes. "You told me this was a guaranteed transaction," Trevor hissed, his voice vibrating with a sudden, vicious rage. He pointed a shaking finger directly at Richard's face. "You explicitly promised me that you held the legal authority to liquidate this asset. You swore to me that the title was clean and that the money would clear on Monday morning without any complications." Richard shrank back into his seat, raising his hands in a futile gesture of defense. "I thought I did hold the authority, Trevor. The legal documents were notarized. I had no idea Charmaine revoked the power of attorney. She never told us. She actively deceived us to set this trap." "Do not blame this on her," Trevor screamed, the volume of his voice shattering the remaining decorum of the upscale restaurant. He slammed both of his hands down onto the crisp white tablecloth, causing the silverware to clatter loudly against the fine china. "You are the one who initiated this sale. You are the one who brought Apex Holdings to the table. You told me to pledge my company as a secondary guarantee for the bridge loan because you were absolutely certain the real estate transfer was bulletproof. You handed my entire corporate entity over to a predatory private equity firm because you were too stupid to verify your own paperwork." My mother Elaine jumped to her feet, deeply offended by the sudden disrespect directed at her husband. Do not speak to your father-in-law that way, Trevor. Richard was only trying to help you secure the funding you begged us for. We put our own home on the line to facilitate this deal. Your home is gone, Elaine, Trevor roared, his face flushing a deep mottled purple. Did you not just hear the corporate lawyer Apex Holdings is seizing all the collateral immediately? Your mansion is gone. Your retirement accounts are entirely wiped out. And my company, the company I built from the ground up, now legally belongs to them. Trevor began pacing frantically behind his chair, his breathing turning rapid and shallow as a full-blown panic attack set in. The heavy gold Rolex on his wrist caught the light of the crystal chandeliers, highlighting the sheer absurdity of his financial choices. He ran his hands through his perfectly styled hair, ruining the expensive cut. You do not understand what you have done to me, Trevor babbled, his voice cracking under the immense pressure of his own hidden crimes. He was unraveling completely, shedding every ounce of his unearned confidence. I needed that $45 million by Monday morning. I absolutely had to have that specific cash injection. I already spent the escrow advances. I used the projected revenue to pay off the immediate operational debts and secure new vendor contracts. I bought inventory. I paid personal expenses. The money is already gone, Richard. A collective gasp rippled down the length of the dining table. My Uncle David, who had toasted to Trevor's brilliance just 30 minutes prior, stared at him in profound horror. The entire extended family realized simultaneously that Trevor had been spending money he did not possess. You spent the escrow advances? Richard asked, his voice barely a whisper. Trevor, that is highly illegal. You cannot touch those funds until the title officially clears. I had to touch the funds, Trevor shouted, completely losing his grip on reality. He was so consumed by panic that he abandoned all sense of self-preservation. He began confessing his crimes to the entire room, desperate to justify his actions. I had to show positive cash flow. The Securities and Exchange Commission scheduled a comprehensive federal audit of Novacor Solutions for this coming Wednesday. The auditors are arriving at my corporate headquarters in 3 days. They are going to demand hard proof of our liquidity and user engagement metrics. The ledgers are completely out of balance. I needed the Sterling Plaza money to cover the internal deficits before the federal agents open the books. Jessica. My sister stood up slowly. Her face was entirely drained of color. The massive diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist suddenly looked incredibly heavy. Trevor, what are you saying? Jessica asked, her voice trembling with absolute terror. What internal deficits? You told me the company was generating record profits. You told me we were about to become billionaires. Why are federal auditors coming to your office? Trevor stopped pacing and stared at his wife with a look of pure, unadulterated cowardice. The golden child's husband had finally been exposed. He was not a tech visionary. He was a corporate fraud who had built a fragile empire on lies and stolen funds. There are no profits, Jessica, Trevor admitted, his voice breaking into a pathetic whine. The company is hemorrhaging money. I fabricated the user acquisition data to secure the initial venture capital. I used the corporate accounts to pay for our vacations, your jewelry, and the down payment on the cars. I was covering the theft with new investor money, but the market shifted. The auditors are going to find the missing funds. I was going to use your father's real estate money to replace the stolen capital. The private dining room descended into absolute madness. The carefully constructed facade of family unity shattered completely, exposing the rotten, self-serving core beneath. Trevor did not offer a single word of apology or comfort to his devastated wife. Instead, the raw survival instincts of a cornered coward aggressively kicked in. He took 2 large steps back from Jessica, looking at her with an expression of pure, unfiltered revulsion. She was no longer his beautiful trophy wife. She was a financial liability dragging him toward a federal prison sentence. This is all your fault, Trevor spat, his voice shaking with venom. You are the one who demanded the lavish lifestyle. You needed the designer clothes, the luxury vacations, the expensive country club memberships. You drained my personal accounts faster than I could fake the corporate revenue to replace it. I embezzled money to keep you quiet and happy. You forced my hand. Jessica gasped, clutching her chest as if physically struck by his words. You lied to me from the very beginning. She sobbed hysterically, mascara running down her flushed cheeks in thick streaks. You told me you were an absolute visionary. You told me we were rich and untouchable. Trevor let out a cruel laugh that echoed against the vaulted ceilings. You were completely blind by choice, Jessica. You never once questioned where the money came from as long as your credit cards kept working. But I am absolutely not going down for this federal crime alone. I am filing for divorce the second I leave this restaurant. The entire table gasped at the sudden cruelty of his declaration. I am legally severing myself from you and this staggeringly incompetent family. Trevor continued, his voice turning desperate and malicious. I will tell the auditors that you manipulated me into stealing the capital. I will give them every single piece of evidence they need to drag you down into the indictment with me. I am protecting whatever fraction of my personal assets I have left, and you are not getting a single dime of it. Jessica collapsed back into her chair, burying her face in her trembling hands. She wailed loudly, a harsh sound of pure despair bouncing off the vintage wine cellars. She turned her desperate tear-streaked face toward our mother. Mom, please do something, Jessica begged, reaching out a shaking hand across the white tablecloth. You have to fix this. You cannot let him leave me with absolutely nothing. You promised me this marriage would secure my financial future forever. Elaine stood frozen for a fraction of a second, her eyes wide with mounting terror, as she processed the collapse of her golden child. The beloved son-in-law had just transformed into a hostile, vicious enemy. Elaine spun around, her rising panic instantly mutating into blind, explosive rage. She focused all of her intense fury entirely on my father. Fix it, Richard! Elaine screamed, her voice cracking violently under the intense pressure. You told me you had this situation completely under control. You swore to me that the real estate paperwork was absolutely bulletproof. How could you be so incredibly stupid? Richard stared at his furious wife, completely paralyzed by the sheer crushing magnitude of his failure. I trusted the legal counsel? He stammered defensively, wiping sweat from his forehead. I trusted the documents I possessed. I did not know Charmaine had the legal awareness to revoke the power of attorney 14 years ago. She maliciously set us up to fail. Elaine slammed her fists hard onto the dining table, fiercely rattling the expensive fine china and crystal glassware. I do not care about Charmaine right now. I care about the fact that you just willingly handed our entire estate over to a ruthless corporate entity. You literally signed away our home. Where exactly are we going to live tomorrow morning, Richard? You traded our beautiful mansion and our entire retirement portfolio for a fake technology company that is about to be seized by the federal government. You completely ruined my life. She grabbed her expensive silk napkin and threw it aggressively at his face. The profound loyalty they had always pretended to share evaporated instantly. It was truly every person for themselves in a desperate scramble for survival. The private dining room was suffocatingly tense, leaving only the sound of Trevor's panicked breathing. The ambient noise of the restaurant outside was muffled, leaving only the sound of Trevor's panicked breathing. My mother Elaine stared at the closed doors with wide, bloodshot eyes. She had just watched her curated social standing evaporate. Her wealthy friends had abandoned her without a second thought. Panic contorted her face, but she refused to accept responsibility. Instead, her frantic gaze swept across the ruined banquet table and locked onto the one person she blamed for every inconvenience. Me. Elaine marched down the length of the private dining room, her designer heels sinking into the plush carpet. She bypassed my defeated father and ignored her sobbing golden child. She stopped a few feet away from my chair, her chest heaving with desperate, entitled rage. She pointed a trembling finger directly at my face. You fix this right now, Charmaine, my mother shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly against the wine cellars. You call whoever manages this Aegis Trust immediately. You tell them there has been a terrible misunderstanding. You order them to surrender the Sterling Plaza building to Apex Holdings, so this breach of contract penalty is wiped out. You are going to save your father from federal prison. I remained perfectly still in my chair, looking up at her flushed, furious face. She was not asking for my help. She was demanding my compliance, fully expecting me to sacrifice my entire future to clean up their mess. Do not just sit there looking at me with that blank expression, Elaine screamed, slamming her palms down onto the table near my plate. You owe us. We gave you a privileged life. We put a roof over your head. You are absolutely nothing without this family. If you do not transfer that building tonight, we will lose everything. Trevor is going to jail and we will be homeless. Fix your mistake right now. I reached out and wrapped my fingers around the stem of my crystal wine glass. I lifted it gracefully, taking a slow sip of the expensive red wine they could no longer afford. I swallowed, placed the glass back onto the crisp white linen, and slowly stood up. I smoothed the front of my tailored navy suit, rising to my full height. The dining room fell completely terrifyingly silent. Marcus and his corporate associates watched me with quiet respect. My father slowly lifted his head from his hands. Trevor stopped his frantic pacing. Even Jessica quieted her hysterical sobbing. For the first time in 34 years, I held the undivided attention of my abusers, and I held their fate entirely in my hands. I owe you absolutely nothing, I stated, my voice ringing with a cold, unwavering clarity that demanded total submission. Let us review exactly what this family has given me. You gave me a childhood defined by emotional neglect and constant suffocating criticism. You painted my bedroom a color I hated just to prove you controlled my environment. You spent my entire adult life belittling my intelligence, mocking my career, and treating me like a pathetic burden. You idolized Jessica because she was superficial, and you worshipped Trevor simply because he projected an arrogant illusion of wealth that you desperately wanted as your own. I took a slow step forward, forcing my mother to instinctively back away from the sheer intensity of my gaze. You did not just verbally abuse me, Elaine. You actively tried to destroy my future. When I turned 20 years old, you and Richard intentionally compromised my judgment with alcohol. You manipulated a naive girl into signing away her entire multi-million-dollar inheritance so you could fund your country club lifestyle. You stole from me without a single ounce of hesitation. And when you realized you could not access the trust, you simply waited for another opportunity to exploit me. I shifted my focus to my father, who was visibly trembling under the harsh lighting of his own failure. Just 4 days ago, you happily informed me that you used my personal apartment as collateral for a bridge loan. You willingly signed documents that would leave your own daughter entirely homeless on a Monday morning. You did not lose a single second of sleep over throwing me out onto the street. You did it to secure illegal funding for a failing, fraudulent company run by a cowardly criminal. You literally tried to sacrifice my basic survival to finance Trevor's embezzlement scheme. Kiki Sai. I turned my attention back to my mother, holding her terrified gaze. You demanded that I surrender my grandparents' legacy to save you from bankruptcy and federal prison. You want me to hand over a $45 million commercial high-rise to Apex Holdings to cover up your staggering incompetence. You are begging the scapegoat to become the sacrificial lamb one last time. I leaned in slightly, lowering my voice to a sharp, lethal whisper that carried effortlessly across the silent room. I will never sign that building over to you. I will not make a single phone call to save Trevor from the federal auditors. I will not lift a single finger to protect this family from the ruin you brought upon yourselves. You signed a fraudulent contract driven by your own insatiable greed, and now you will face the absolute maximum penalties that the law allows. Elaine gasped, tears of genuine panic spilling over her eyelashes. She looked at me as if I had just transformed into a monster, completely unable to comprehend the iron boundary I had just erected. You cannot mean that, Charmaine. You cannot just stand there and watch your own parents lose everything. Apex Holdings is going to seize the mansion. They are going to take our retirement. They will destroy us completely. I did not flinch. Yes, they will, I confirmed softly. The absolute certainty in my voice finally shattered the last remaining fragments of my father's pride. Richard stumbled backward, his knees giving out as the immense weight of his actions crashed down upon him. He collapsed onto the thick dining room carpet, the expensive fabric muffling the sound of his knees hitting the floor. For my entire life, this man had projected an image of untouchable authority and supreme arrogance. He had commanded every room he entered, dictating the lives of his wife and daughters with an iron fist. Now he was reduced to a trembling, broken shell of a patriarch, hyperventilating in front of the very corporate executioners he had invited to dinner. He did not look at me or my mother. Instead, he crawled on his knees toward Marcus, grabbing the razor-sharp crease of the lawyer's tailored trousers. "Please, you have to help me," Richard begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. Tears streamed down his reddened face, dripping onto the pristine collar of his dress shirt. "You must have some discretionary power to negotiate these terms. I will sign whatever you want. I will liquidate my secondary portfolios and pay a structured settlement. Just please do not let Apex Holdings seize my primary residence. They are notorious in the financial sector. Everyone knows they are absolute vultures. They are completely ruthless, and they will destroy my family without a second thought. Please, I am begging you on my knees, you cannot let them take everything I have worked for." Marcus looked down at my father with an expression of pure clinical indifference. He gently but firmly pried my father's shaking hands off his suit pants, stepping back to create a distinct physical boundary. "I am merely the chief legal officer, Richard," Marcus stated, adjusting his cuffs with meticulous precision. "I do not possess the executive authority to negotiate breach of contract penalties, nor do I have the power to halt an active asset seizure. If you wish to beg for mercy, I suggest you address your pleas to the Chief Executive Officer of Apex Holdings. My father blinked, his tear-filled eyes darting wildly around the private dining room. "The CEO is the CEO here," he stammered frantically, searching the faces of the two silent corporate associates standing near the locked mahogany doors. "Please introduce me to him. I will explain the misunderstanding. I will make this right." I took a slow, deliberate step forward, moving until I was standing directly in front of my kneeling father. The crystal chandelier overhead cast a brilliant, harsh light on his terrified face. I looked down at him, feeling absolutely no pity, no remorse, and no hesitation. This was the exact moment I had patiently waited for over the last 14 years. "You are right about one thing, Dad," I said, my voice dropping to a smooth, lethal register that sliced through his panicked sobbing. "Apex Holdings is incredibly ruthless." Richard looked up at me, his brow furrowing in profound confusion. He was still entirely incapable of connecting the dots. He still viewed me as the pathetic, underachieving daughter who needed to be told what to do. Because I built it that way, I delivered the final crushing blow. The words hung in the suffocating air for a fraction of a second before the reality violently detonated inside the room. A collective, audible gasp erupted from the few extended family members who had lingered near the locked doors. My mother Elaine let out a sharp, strangled noise, clapping both hands over her mouth as her eyes widened to an impossible size. Jessica stopped breathing entirely, her manicured hands freezing mid-air. Trevor, the supposedly brilliant tech visionary, physically recoiled, his jaw dropping open in absolute unadulterated shock. My father remained frozen on his knees, staring up at me as if I had just spoken to him in an alien language. His brain aggressively rejected the information, unable to reconcile the massive corporate predator that was destroying his life with the quiet daughter he had relentlessly abused. "What did you just say?" Richard whispered, his voice trembling so violently the words barely formed. "I am the sole owner, founder, and chief executive officer of Apex Holdings," I announced, projecting my voice so every single person in the room could hear the absolute truth. "I am the vulture you were just begging for mercy. I am the ruthless corporate entity that is currently seizing your mansion, liquidating your retirement accounts, and absorbing your son-in-law's fraudulent startup. I am the one who orchestrated this entire acquisition, and I am the one who just authorized your complete financial annihilation." The sheer magnitude of the revelation paralyzed the entire family. They were trapped in a room with a monster of their own making. I watched their minds race frantically reviewing every insult, every condescending remark, and every cruel joke they had directed at me over the past decade. They had spent years mocking my career, assuming I was a low-level programmer scraping by in a tiny apartment. They had confidently declared that I severely lacked the fundamental vision to ever manage real estate or navigate complex capital markets. "You cannot be the CEO!" Trevor blurted out, his voice cracking, as his fragile ego desperately tried to protect itself. Apex Holdings is a multi-billion-dollar private equity firm. They manage global portfolios. You just write back-end code. You are just a spinster. You do not have the aggressive intellect required to build an institutional financial vehicle. I turned my gaze to Trevor, pinning him to his chair with a look of pure, concentrated disdain. "I built Apex Holdings from the ground up using the initial capital I secured by protecting my inheritance from you and my parents 14 years ago. You blindly handed me the absolute power to legally dismantle your entire fake empire without putting up a single fight today." I reached into my tailored suit pocket and extracted a slim leather portfolio I had brought specifically for this precise moment. I tossed it onto the table next to the colossal pile of breach notifications. The sleek leather slid across the white linen and stopped directly in front of my father. "Open it," I commanded, my voice slicing through the heavy silence of the dining room. Richard stared at the portfolio as if it were a venomous snake, his hands trembling too violently to grasp the zipper. Marcus stepped forward smoothly, opening the portfolio and spreading its contents across the table. These were not standard legal notices. They were certified, federally filed incorporation documents, bearing the raised seal of the state. "Those are the original formation papers for Aegis Trust," I explained, projecting my voice so every remaining family member could hear the undeniable truth. "And right beneath them are the corporate registration filings for Apex Holdings. If you look closely at the ownership structure, you will see a direct, unbroken line connecting the two entities. Aegis Trust is the parent company of Apex Holdings. I am the sole trustee of Aegis, and therefore the absolute owner of Apex." Trevor leaned forward, his eyes frantically scanning the dense legal text. He was desperately searching for a loophole, a technicality, any possible escape route from the slaughterhouse he had walked into. "This makes no sense," Trevor stammered, his breathing shallow and erratic. "Why would you buy your own building? You basically just sold the property to yourself." I offered a sharp, merciless smile. "I did not buy my own building, Trevor. I created a highly attractive, seemingly vulnerable corporate buyer to see if my father would take the bait. I wanted to see if his greed would outweigh his basic legal due diligence. The contract you so eagerly signed was not a standard acquisition agreement. It was a customized, highly predatory legal trap specifically engineered to absorb all of your pledged assets the very second you committed fraud. We dangled a $45 million carrot, and you swallowed it whole without bothering to check the structural integrity of the bridge. You see, Richard," I continued, turning my attention back to my broken father, "a standard real estate transaction includes grace periods and cure clauses for title defects, but my legal team drafted the Apex Holdings purchase agreement to completely bypass those standard protections. We classified your failure to provide a clean title not as an administrative error, but as an intentional material breach of contract. By presenting that legally dead power of attorney to the escrow officers, you officially triggered the immediate forfeiture protocol. The contract was practically begging you to lie. You thought you were outsmarting the market, but you were merely playing the exact role I wrote for you. You provided the fraudulent intent, and I simply provided the legal mechanism to punish it." My mother Elaine pressed her hands against her temples, her face pale with mounting horror. "But the waiver," she gasped, her voice barely a whisper. "You signed the waiver this afternoon. We saw you sign it in the living room. You relinquished your rights to contest the sale." I let out a soft, humorless laugh that echoed through the silent room. "I signed exactly what was put in front of me, Elaine." I looked at Marcus, who swiftly retrieved the waiver of claims document from his briefcase and held it up for the entire room to see. I highly suggest you actually look at the signature line this time. You were all so incredibly eager to pack my belongings and force me out of my apartment that you completely ignored the most important detail on the page. Richard grabbed the document from Marcus, his eyes squinting as he focused on the bottom of the page. He stared at the messy looping scrawl I had hastily applied earlier that afternoon. Then his gaze dropped to the printed line directly beneath the signature. His jaw fell open and a strangled noise escaped his throat. "Read it aloud, Richard." I ordered, my tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. "Tell your brilliant son-in-law exactly what title I claimed when I signed that release." Richard swallowed hard, his voice trembling uncontrollably. "Chief Executive Officer." He read the words sounding like glass shattering in his mouth. "Apex Holdings." "Precisely," I confirmed, stepping closer to the table. "I did not sign that document as Charmaine, the vulnerable daughter you were trying to render homeless. I signed it as the Chief Executive Officer of the acquiring corporation, officially accepting your fraudulent collateral on behalf of my firm. I was not surrendering my rights to the property. I was officially sealing your fate. You handed me the pen you demanded my signature, and you actively forced me to complete the legal destruction of your entire estate. You literally threatened to disown me if I did not execute the exact document required to finalize your bankruptcy." I stood quietly there, watching the horrifying realization wash over my family. The arrogant certainty that defined their existence was completely obliterated by a single sheet of paper. They had blindly rushed into a sophisticated corporate trap, driven entirely by their desperate need for unearned social dominance and superiority. The profound weight of their own staggering ignorance crushed the remaining life out of the room. Jessica buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent, hysterical sobs. Trevor stared blankly at the wall, completely defeated by a woman he had spent years openly despising. They had spent their entire lives underestimating my intelligence, deeming me stupid, worthless, and fundamentally incapable of grasping complex concepts. They firmly believed their white male privilege and suburban country club status somehow granted them automatic superiority over my quiet diligence. They assumed my silence was evidence of weakness. They never considered that my silence was actually the disciplined patience of a highly calculated predator, perfectly positioned to strike. I slowly turned my gaze away from my parents and fixed my undivided attention on Trevor. He was still sitting frozen in his chair at the side of the table, his complexion resembling spoiled milk. The heavy gold Rolex on his wrist suddenly looked like an anchor waiting to drag him straight to the bottom of the ocean. He tried to swallow, but his throat was visibly dry. He knew with absolute terrifying certainty that he was next. I walked around the edge of the large dining table, taking slow, measured steps until I was standing directly beside him. I leaned down slightly, invading his personal space just as he had done to me in the driveway hours earlier. "Let us talk about leverage, Trevor," I said, my voice smooth and conversational. "You spent a considerable amount of time this afternoon lecturing me on how capital is just a tool to manipulate reality. You boasted about your aggressive intellect and your visionary status in the technology sector. You claimed that I simply thought like a poor person." I signaled to Marcus. He pulled a sleek black folder from his briefcase and placed it squarely on Trevor's empty dinner plate. "Open it," I commanded. Trevor's hands shook violently as he fumbled with the cover. Inside was a single sheet of paper bearing the official seal of a corporate debt restructuring firm. It detailed the immediate acquisition of Novacore Solutions' outstanding liabilities. "Your startup has been bleeding cash for 18 months, I explained, ensuring every word resonated perfectly through the quiet room. "You secured your initial venture capital using fabricated user acquisition metrics. When the money ran out, you took on highly toxic short-term debt with exorbitant interest rates just to keep the lights on and fund Jessica's shopping habits. You used your own company stock as the primary guarantee for those predatory loans. You effectively mortgaged your entire corporate entity to creditors who wanted nothing more than to see you fail so they could absorb your intellectual property. Trevor stared at the document, his eyes wide with mounting terror. My analysts identified your critical vulnerabilities 3 weeks ago, I continued. We tracked the massive internal deficits you were hiding from your board of directors. We knew the federal auditors were scheduled to arrive this coming Wednesday. We knew you were desperately seeking a massive cash injection to cover up your extensive corporate wire fraud. So my hedge fund quietly purchased all of your toxic debt from your desperate creditors earlier this week. We bought your liabilities for pennies on the dollar. I paused, letting the silence stretch for a fraction of a second before delivering the kill shot. I own your company now, Trevor. I stated the words, striking him like physical blows. I hold every single note on your outstanding debt. Because you defaulted on your covenants by misrepresenting your revenue, I have legally activated the acceleration clauses. I am calling in all of your loans immediately, and since you cannot pay, I am legally seizing Novacore Solutions. I am liquidating it tomorrow morning. Your career in tech is over. Trevor let out a devastating, high-pitched whimper. The invincible tech bro facade completely shattered into a million irreparable pieces. He slumped forward, burying his face in his hands as a wave of uncontrollable sobbing overtook him. The sound of his weeping was pathetic and entirely devoid of dignity. He cried loudly, his shoulders heaving under his expensive tailored blazer, completely unable to process the severe magnitude of his own staggering, irreversible collapse. This was the man who had confidently declared that white men in tech dictated the global economy. This was the man who had mocked my clothing, my career, and my single status. Now he was reduced to a crying, defeated mess, utterly dismantled by the very woman he had consistently degraded. I looked down at him with absolute, unwavering disgust. The sheer entitlement he had paraded around the family for years was entirely stripped away. He had built his entire identity on the illusion of superiority, convinced that his gender and his empty charisma automatically granted him a seat at the billionaire's table. He genuinely believed that screaming into a smartphone and buying luxury watches on credit made him a titan of industry. He failed to understand that real power does not need to boast in a driveway. Real power operates in absolute silence until it is time to execute the final maneuver. Jessica watched her husband sobbing onto the white tablecloth with an expression of pure, unadulterated revulsion. She slowly pushed her chair away from him, physically creating distance between herself and the profound failure he represented. She realized that Trevor was not a genius who was going to elevate her social status. He was a convicted fraudster who had just dragged her into a massive federal investigation. Her dreams of yachts and designer wardrobes were dead, replaced by the impending reality of bankruptcy hearings and asset seizures. You ruined everything, Jessica hissed at him, her voice trembling with selfish fury. You lied to me. You promised we were going to be rich. You are an absolute loser, Trevor. Trevor did not even possess the strength to argue back. He kept his face buried in his hands, his loud, gasping sobs echoing through the private dining room. He had lost his company, his wealth, his marriage, and his freedom in the span of exactly 5 minutes. I stood over him, feeling a deep, resonating sense of pure justice. He had told me to take notes so I could learn how the real world operates. I had not only taken notes, but I had rewritten the entire rulebook, ensuring he would never work in the financial sector again. I had taken his greatest source of pride and turned it into the very instrument of his complete annihilation. The toxic white male privilege he paraded around had been entirely dismantled by the woman he had constantly mocked. With Trevor neutralized, I slowly pivoted my attention back to the head of the banquet table, where my parents sat in a state of catatonic shock. My mother Elaine was gripping the edge of the table so tightly, her knuckles were translucent. The grand illusion of their untouchable suburban aristocracy had been brutally stripped away, exposing the terrified, fragile people hiding beneath the designer clothing and expensive perfumes. Marcus, anticipating my next move with flawless professional synchronicity, reached into his leather briefcase one final time. He retrieved a set of thick manila envelopes sealed with stark red cautionary tape. I stopped directly in front of my father. I did not need to shout to establish dominance. True power is delivered in a precise, measured whisper. Richard. I began using his first name to officially sever any remaining familial ties. When you sat in the living room this afternoon and threatened to permanently disown me, you were operating under the profound delusion that you held all the cards. You confidently assured your son-in-law that your financial maneuvers were bulletproof. You were so incredibly eager to fund his fraudulent technology company that you failed to perform even the most basic risk assessment on the bridge loan you actively secured. I dropped the first heavy manila envelope onto his empty dinner plate. It landed with a definitive heavy smack that made my mother physically flinch. "Open it," I commanded, my tone leaving absolutely no room for hesitation or debate. My father stared at the envelope as if it were coated in lethal poison. His hands shook violently as he reached out and tore open the flap. He pulled out a stack of legally binding foreclosure notices, bearing the official raised stamp of the county clerk. The bold black letters at the top of the page spelled out his total unavoidable ruin. He blinked rapidly, his eyes struggling to focus on the terrifying legal text. As Marcus explained earlier, Apex Holdings does not negotiate with individuals who commit federal wire fraud, I stated, making sure Elaine heard every single syllable. To facilitate the massive cash advance Trevor demanded, you willingly pledged your primary residential estate as the collateral for the bridge loan. You literally signed away the deed to the Fairfield mansion to guarantee a transaction based entirely on a legally dead power of attorney. Because you deliberately triggered the immediate breach of contract penalties, the primary collateral is automatically forfeited to the buyer. My mother let out a shrill, suffocating gasp that echoed off the vintage wine cellars. "The house?" Elaine cried out, her voice cracking with mounting hysteria. "Charmaine, you cannot possibly mean the house. That is our family home. We have lived there for 30 years. I host the country club charity gala there every single spring. My friends are coming over next week. You cannot take my home away from me." I turned my cold gaze toward her, feeling absolutely zero pity for the woman who had spent my entire childhood making me feel utterly worthless. "It is no longer your home, Elaine. It is now a highly depreciable asset sitting on the commercial balance sheets of Apex Holdings. You used the very roof over my head as a bargaining chip today. You gleefully told me to pack my bags and vacate my apartment just so you could clear garage space for Trevor's luxury sports cars. Now the exact same unforgiving standard is being applied to you." I pointed a manicured finger at the legal documents clutched in my father's trembling hands. "The property legally transferred ownership to my corporate entity the exact moment you failed to provide a clean title for Sterling Plaza today. The documents you are holding are immediate eviction mandates approved by a superior court judge this afternoon. Because you engaged in a fraudulent commercial transaction, standard grace periods for foreclosure simply do not apply." Richard let out a hollow, defeated groan, his head dropping heavily onto his chest. He was completely broken. The patriarch who had ruled our family through financial intimidation and emotional manipulation had just been financially eradicated by his own staggering arrogance. The county sheriff has already been dispatched with the final execution orders. I continued delivering the final, inescapable truth. Law enforcement officers will be arriving at the Fairfield estate gate at exactly 8 o'clock tomorrow morning to oversee your immediate eviction. They will change the locks, secure the perimeter, and seize any remaining valuable assets inside the property to cover the outstanding balance of your $20 million penalty. Elaine began to weep loudly, her carefully applied makeup running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. "Where are we supposed to go?" she begged, her hands reaching out toward me across the table. "Charmaine, please. You are our daughter. You have a massive company. You have billions of dollars. You can stop this. You can give us a small loan to get an apartment. We will have absolutely nothing." "You will have exactly what you gave me when you tried to steal my inheritance," I replied, stepping back to avoid her grasping hands. "You will have nothing. I strongly suggest you leave this dinner immediately, drive back to the house you no longer own, and start packing your bags. You have less than 12 hours before the authorities physically escort you off my property." The absolute, undeniable finality of my words crushed the last remaining spark of defiance out of the room. My father did not argue. He did not yell. He slowly pushed his chair back and stood up, moving like a man who had suddenly aged 20 years in a single hour. He looked at me, his eyes hollow and defeated, finally recognizing the ruthless, formidable woman I had become. He realized he could never undo the catastrophic damage caused by his lifelong pattern of unyielding toxic arrogance. The patriarch had officially fallen, and the total inescapable justice I had carefully orchestrated was finally complete. The crushing reality of my father's surrender rippled outward, infecting the extended family members who were still trapped inside the private dining room. For my entire life, these aunts, uncles, and cousins had eagerly participated in my marginalization. But now, staring at the undeniable legal proof of federal wire fraud, imminent bankruptcy, and my absolute corporate dominance, their superficial loyalty instantly evaporated. Uncle David was the first to physically distance himself from the wreckage. He adjusted his tailored suit jacket, refusing to even look at my father. "This is absolutely unconscionable, Richard," David stated, his voice ringing with extreme performative moral outrage. "You dragged us all here to celebrate a criminal enterprise. You jeopardized the entire family's reputation just to fund a scam." My mother whipped her head around her tear-stained face, twisting in desperate panic. "David, please," Elaine begged. "You have to help us. You could loan us enough to hire a decent defense attorney, or at least help us secure a temporary apartment." Aunt Susan scoffed loudly, stepping firmly out of my mother's reach. "Are you out of your mind, Elaine? You attempted to steal millions from your own daughter. We will not let your financial incompetence drag our credit ratings down into the mud. You are completely on your own." One by one, the rest of the relatives began hastily gathering their coats and belongings. Trevor tried to corner a wealthy cousin near the door, frantically pitching a desperate plea for a microloan. The cousin simply shoved Trevor aside, treating the disgraced tech founder like an infectious disease. The mass exodus was swift, brutal, and utterly silent. Within 3 minutes, the once vibrant, celebratory dining room was abandoned by everyone except the immediate, ruined family and my stoic legal team. I stood perfectly still at the head of the table, absorbing the sheer, magnificent poetry of the moment. I had not just taken their money, I had methodically stripped away their entire support system. They were completely isolated, locked in a luxurious cage with no allies, no resources, and absolutely no way out. I turned to Marcus, giving him a subtle, approving nod. "We are finished here, Marcus. Ensure the security teams are positioned at the Fairfield estate by dawn. I want the asset seizure executed with 0 delays." "Understood, boss," Marcus replied, snapping his briefcase shut. He and his 2 associates offered me a respectful nod before turning and exiting through the heavy mahogany doors, leaving the terrifying reality of their paperwork behind on the ruined banquet table. I slowly walked over to the brass coat rack standing near the entrance. I retrieved my cashmere trench coat, slipping it on with deliberate, unhurried movements. The sound of my heels clicking against the hardwood floor caused Jessica to look up from her hands. Her face was red and swollen, completely stripped of the arrogant beauty she wielded like a weapon her entire life. She looked at me not with hatred, but with profound, paralyzing fear. I had become an unrecognizable force of nature, a ruthless architect of destruction who had effortlessly dismantled her perfect, unearned existence. I stepped over the shattered egos of my abusers, moving gracefully past the scattered chairs and spilled wine. I stopped briefly near my mother, who was hyperventilating into a linen napkin. "There is one final administrative detail you need to handle tonight, Elaine," I announced, making sure my voice carried over her pathetic sobbing. "Since you and Richard proudly hosted this extravagant closing dinner to celebrate your massive financial windfall, the restaurant management opened a very generous tab under your name. I suggest you pool together whatever remaining balances you have on your personal credit cards before the banks officially freeze them at midnight. It would be a terrible shame if you were arrested for defrauding a 5-star restaurant on the very same night you lost your home." My father groaned, dropping his head heavily onto the table. The cost of the imported caviar and vintage wine was now a crushing, insurmountable debt they simply could not pay. I did not wait for their response. I turned my back on them forever and walked confidently out of the private dining room. I pushed open the restaurant's main doors and stepped out into the crisp, cool night air. The city lights glittered against the dark sky. A sleek chauffeur-driven Maybach was idling quietly at the curb, waiting for me. The driver stepped out, opening the heavy rear door with a respectful bow. I slid into the leather interior, inhaling a breath of absolute freedom. The suffocating weight of their toxic expectations, the years of relentless emotional abuse, and the heavy burden of being their designated scapegoat were permanently erased. I had finally severed the chains of my past. As the Maybach pulled away from the curb, I looked out the window, leaving them trapped in the ruins of their own spectacular greed. 6 months have passed since that spectacular night of absolute justice. The catastrophic fallout from their staggering greed was swift, brutal, and entirely public. My father Richard and my mother Elaine were forcibly evicted from their lavish Fairfield estate 12 hours after the celebration dinner collapsed. The county sheriff arrived at dawn, escorting them off the premises, while neighborhood gossips watched them from their perfectly manicured front lawns. Today, they live in a cramped two-bedroom apartment in a building on the industrial outskirts of the city. Their designer wardrobes and antique furniture were liquidated at auction to cover basic legal consultation fees, and their exclusive country club memberships were immediately revoked. They now survive strictly on basic Social Security checks and a tight weekly grocery budget. Elaine spends her days bitterly clipping coupons at the kitchen table, a harsh reality she once mocked other people for enduring. Richard rarely leaves the tiny, poorly insulated apartment. His former business associates refuse his calls, and the profound humiliation of his public downfall has completely broken his spirit. They thought they were untouchable suburban aristocrats, but the brutal mechanics of the financial world reduced them to absolute irrelevance in a single night. Trevor experienced an even steeper plunge into total devastation. When Monday morning arrived, the federal auditors from the Securities and Exchange Commission tore through his corporate ledgers, just as my financial analysts had accurately predicted. Without the $45 million from my stolen inheritance to cover up his massive embezzlement, his entire software company imploded in a matter of hours. The authorities discovered the fabricated user metrics, illicit offshore wire transfers, and the egregious misuse of restricted investor capital. Trevor was officially indicted on multiple felony counts of federal wire fraud and malfeasance. He currently sits in a high-security federal detention center, desperately awaiting a highly publicized criminal trial that will inevitably result in a lengthy, inescapable prison sentence. The arrogant white tech bro who proudly flashed a solid gold Rolex bought on credit now wears a standard-issue orange prison jumpsuit. His bloated ego was systematically dismantled by the relentless machinery of the federal justice system, completely erasing the loud, unearned confidence he used to manipulate my foolish parents. He tried to play a billionaire's game without understanding the rules of compliance, and the house collected everything he owned. My younger sister Jessica faced a uniquely humiliating reckoning of her own. Trevor officially filed for divorce the moment his legal troubles began, attempting to shield his hidden offshore assets from the federal government. He failed, of course, but the immediate legal separation left Jessica with absolutely nothing. Her diamond tennis bracelets and luxury vehicles were immediately seized by federal agents to partially compensate the defrauded venture capitalists. Stripped of her golden child status and her fake wealth, Jessica was introduced to the grueling reality of the working class. She now works a minimum-wage retail job at a generic department store in a dying local shopping mall. The girl who once scoffed at my modest clothing now spends 40 hours a week folding discounted sweaters and dealing with rude, demanding customers. Her signature arrogance has been eradicated by the exhausting grind of basic survival. She takes the public bus to work every single morning because she cannot afford a reliable car. The profound sense of entitlement that defined her entire personality was aggressively burned away, leaving behind a quiet, defeated woman who finally understands the true value of a dollar earned through physical labor. As for me, I am standing at the towering floor-to-ceiling windows of my private penthouse office, located on the top executive floor of Sterling Plaza. This commercial high-rise is my rightful protected legacy. I did not just save my grandparents' building from being liquidated by a desperate fraudster. I integrated it perfectly into the rapidly expanding global portfolio of Apex Holdings. I run a multi-billion-dollar private equity empire, free from the toxic influence of my biological family. I do not have to hide my phenomenal success in the shadows anymore. I do not have to shrink my personality to make insecure, greedy people feel powerful. I navigate the most complex corporate acquisitions in the country with unwavering confidence. My wealth is not an illusion built on predatory bridge loans, forged signatures, or falsified user metrics. It is a concrete fortress constructed through years of silent, disciplined execution and relentless strategic planning. I reclaimed my entire narrative, forcefully stepping out of the pathetic scapegoat role they assigned me and claiming my rightful position as an undisputed titan of industry. I look out over the sprawling city skyline, watching the bustling financial district operate far below my feet. The view from the absolute top is exceptionally clear when you finally remove the parasitic people who spent decades trying to drag you down into their own bitter misery. I protected my future by understanding the immense power of the fine print. The law is a magnificent weapon, and I wield it with unforgiving precision against those who attempt to cross me. I took the very corporation they desperately hoped would save them and used it as the ultimate instrument of their total financial destruction. They truly believed they could effortlessly manipulate my legacy to fund their pathetic vanity projects. They were so blindly consumed by their own staggering narcissism that they never stopped to verify the legal documents they signed or the corporate opponent they were actively attempting to defraud. I watched them build a fragile glass house on top of a massive fault line, and I was the earthquake that shattered it into a million tiny pieces. My toxic family tried to bury me alive, but they completely forgot that I actually owned the shovel all along. They tried to sell my future, so I just legally bought theirs. Have you ever had to use the fine print to destroy a toxic family member? Let me know in the comments.